How did people survive the Ice Age? In a nutshell, it seems nearly impossible, doesn't it? We were one of the weakest creatures back then. We had no thick fur or proper defense, and the weather was cold. Temperatures could drop to -40 degrees. If you kept your eyes open, they could freeze shut in an instant. Imagine living in that era, hiding out in caves while you waited for the storm to pass. The cold wasn't even the worst part. You needed to hunt. You were hunted by wild bears and saber-toothed cats during the day, and packs of wolves, each the size of a man, followed you at night. Food? There was no agriculture. Nothing could be grown. Going out for every meal meant risking it all, fighting for survival with stone tools and sharp bones, trying to catch something, to hunt, to stave off starvation. Even if you returned, there was a chance that one of your companions would not. Even if you survived the cold, hunters, and starvation, life was short. You would likely die before you reached your 30s. Even if you did, your loved ones would die. This was not the life you wanted. The population during the Ice Age was about 10 to 15,000 people, according to scholarly research. Now, after this brief summary, let's relive those moments together. Sip a drink and stick around to the end. Our world is like a living entity, constantly changing, renewing, and reshaping itself. Sometimes these changes are quiet and imperceptible. Other times powerful enough to alter the fate of the entire planet. Earth's history has seen numerous such turning points, but one of them is forever etched into the memory of both nature and humanity. The Ice Ages. According to scientists, the Earth has experienced at least 5 major ice ages throughout its history. This number is thought to be higher by some researchers, but those 5 periods are supported by evidence. We now turn our attention to the most recent of these, the most recent Ice Age, in which humanity was involved. A time when the world was frozen and life itself faced the threat of extinction. Imagine. Ice sheets stretching for thousands of kilometers cover cities, mountains, and seas. The ground is as hard as rock, the air deadly cold. The sun rarely shines, and there is no precipitation. It was impossible to farm. Hunting was the only way for people to survive. Meat was their staple, and fire their only hope for survival. But in this harsh world, people weren't just fighting to survive. They were rewriting the meaning of what it was to be human. There was more to the first rock face paintings than just art. It was hope, born from fear. The crackle of fire was more than just warmth. It was the sound of life. From the hot plains of Africa to the frozen valleys of Europe, people migrated, discovering new lands, learning about life. The cold tested them, hunger changed them, and fear made them stronger. Humanity also found a way around every time the ice got close. Because the strongest people do not last in this world, however, the most adaptable. While the ages passed and the ice melted, one thing remained constant: that humankind's unquenchable fire. This is not just a story of the past. It tells the tale of human perseverance, because the survivors of that era are us today. And every breath we take is a continuation of that ancient struggle. Earth fell into a state of silence about 115,000 years ago. The skies were covered with gray clouds. The warmth of the sun grew faint, and the world slowly began to freeze. The last ice age was the next significant turning point in the history of our planet. Additionally, this time period spanned a full 104,000 years. Throughout this time, nature tested humankind, sometimes mercilessly, at other times with a miraculous patience. However, this did not imply that ice covered the entire planet. Number. While some regions of the planet froze, others continued to breathe. The ice began to recede 11,000 years ago, as if the world were awakening from a long slumber. Giant ice sheets still dominated the poles, but elsewhere, life was being reborn. Meltwater from the mountains turned into rivers, and the land breathed again. It was the world's rebirth. And then, we were there too. Our species, Homo sapiens, was already on Earth. But we were not alone. We shared the same planet as the Neanderthals. The harsh, frozen regions of Eurasia were where they resided, finding shelter in the cliffs, battling the fire. We, modern humans, were in both Africa and Eurasia. Two human species, the beginning of two different destinies. In Africa, life was somewhat easier. The weather was milder, and nature was more kind. The sun still warmed the land, rivers flowed, and game could be found. But in Eurasia, the line between life and death existed there. The cold breathed down its neck at every turn. Life was snuffed out with just one wrong move. The Neanderthals had muscular bodies, were tough in the cold, and were strong. However, we were different. Our advantage was our minds. We could plan, dream, and think. We didn't just want to survive. We wanted to create, to learn, to understand the past. The world was still covered in ice at that time, but we were already bringing back the sound of life. The very first stone tools and paintings on rocks, and the very first tales told by the fire. These were more than just relics from the past. They were the sound of humanity's resilience. As the ice melted, life changed. Animals were multiplying, plants were sprouting, and the world was once again taking on color. But one question remained. Who would survive in this new world? The Neanderthal or us? We already know the answer. But back then, everything was as fragile as a breath, a hunt, a spark.
Imagine, ice covers a third of the world's surface. Every mountain, every river, every valley, frozen in a cold winter's silence. This was the harshest time of the Ice Age. The seas were also distinctive. They had much lower levels than they do now. There was never a Caspian Sea. There was still water in the Persian Gulf. The Red Sea had essentially transformed into a lake. Even the Mediterranean Sea did not resemble an ocean as it does today. It resembled more of an interior sea. The surface of the Earth was not the only thing to change. The land had also changed. Japan was still part of Asia, a landmass connected to the continent, not an island. But the most astonishing thing was the existence of a land bridge between America and Asia. Yes, that is accurate. There was a bridge between North America and Asia that humans and animals could cross. This had only been made possible by the power of the ice. A large part of the planet's water reserves had frozen, and sea levels had dropped by several hundred meters. This world was completely different. People and animals were compelled to explore these new lands, because the seas had retreated, revealing new territory. Riverbeds that were once beneath the sea now extend as dry land.
All of this was evidence of the icy, vengeful power of nature. For humans and animals alike, every step could be life-changing. One wrong step risked being trapped beneath the frozen ground. However, every step also meant that new lands, new prey, and new life would be discovered. The land reconnected, the seas rose once more, and the world regained its equilibrium as the ice melted. But the secrets of that era, the hidden land bridges and the frozen lakes, continue to tell one of history's greatest tales.
Imagine, even the world's hottest regions were ice cold in some parts of our planet because of the severe weather. The equator, this tropical haven that we are familiar with for its 31 degrees Celsius heat, back then, it was only 7 degrees Celsius. Yes, you heard that right. Even in the hottest, sunniest place on Earth, a chill could be felt. Life there was difficult for the creatures that lived there. But the Arctic regions, they were frozen solid to a deadly degree. The temperature hovered around -50 degrees Celsius, even in the harshest polar regions. It was so cold you could see your every breath in the frozen air. Every step, every movement represented the fine line between life and death. For humans and animals, the difference was mostly felt in the warmer places, because they were more aware of their surroundings. Plants, animals, water sources, everything had diminished, changed. Now, even the most habitable areas of the planet appeared to be a chilly wasteland. The disparity was not limited to the numbers. It was an actual test of life. The hot areas had frozen over, and the cold areas were dangerous. Every person, every animal, every sprouting plant had to adapt to this new, harsh reality. And consider, such varied, such severe temperature differences. It was still a massive scenario of change for the Earth. Life began to resurface as the ice receded. The temperature differences diminished and the ice melted. However, the extreme cold and temperature variations of that time period still exist in the Earth's deep layers, hidden from history. Now, let's look at the people. The weather was ice cold, there was no rain, and the land was frozen. It was impossible to farm. Hunting was the only way to survive. Their primary source of nourishment was meat, and in order for them to survive, they needed to be skilled hunters. The majority of people at the time lived in North Africa. However, they weren't just in Africa. There were also individuals in numerous regions of Europe, Asia, India, and Australia. Surprisingly, neither the Arctic nor some parts of the Americas were inhabited. In those days, life on Earth was extremely difficult. The weather was painfully cold, the winds were harsh, and the ground was frozen solid. The snow would not melt for months because there was not much rain. In such a world, getting a crop from the land, that is, farming, was almost impossible. Nature seemed to be challenging people as if to say, "What can you do?" To survive under such harsh conditions, people had one option left: hunting. They tracked animals, set traps, and hunted in groups to survive. Meat was more than just food in that era. It was life itself. Finding meat was the primary means of providing food for the family and staying warm. Anyone who was incapable of doing so had a very difficult time surviving. In those days, it was not enough to be strong to survive. It was vitally important to be a smart, patient, and observant hunter. Despite the harshness of the environment, there were humans all over the world. The largest human populations at that time lived in the warm and relatively favorable regions of North Africa. The climate in these areas was milder than in others. The ground did not freeze solid, and there were water sources. However, people didn't just live in Africa. They also lived in ice-covered European forests, vast Asian plains, the southern part of India, and some Australian coastal areas. However, not every part of the world was inhabited by humans. There were no human remains at the North Pole or in some parts of the Americas because they were too cold and uninhabitable. Polar winds froze everything, and snowdrifts rose to tens of meters. In these regions, there was neither game nor shelter to be found. People moved to new places where they could live. Some groups moved toward the plains where there were more animals, while others moved toward warmer regions. Where the game was plentiful was what they used to define their lives. Their mute struggle for survival was part of every migration and step. Hunting was not just a way to find food, but an art of living. People had learned to track the movement of animals, recognize their tracks, calculate the direction of the wind, and move as a unit. It was through their mutual trust, division of labor, and sharing of experience that humanity managed to survive. The world was going through yet another difficult trial around 30,000 years ago. The ice was still beginning to retreat, but the cold weather was not letting up. Already, people were realizing that strength was not enough to survive. They also needed wit and preparation. As a result, a brand new trend emerged: clothing. However, these garments were more than just clothing. They were a shield for life, a defense against the cold. Garments made from animal skins wrapped their bodies, protecting them from the harsh winds and frozen air. Every stitch in the leather held a story, every seam a struggle for life. But clothing alone was not enough. Fire was now familiar territory for humans. Fire. It didn't just provide warmth, it was life itself. It protected them from the freezing cold at night, shielding them from predators. Fire also made it possible to cook food, not just to stave off hunger, but to store energy. But neither fire nor clothing were their greatest weapons. The public had their minds set on it. They had begun to learn, to make plans, to consult, to cooperate with one another. They would devise strategies for a hunt, discuss the results, and share their experiences. It meant life in every word, action, and plan. Because a lone person could be defeated quickly, but together, a group could overcome any obstacle. Every new day, every new hunt, every flame, a new lesson in life. Now imagine, a world covered in ice. People fighting for survival. Fire, hides, plans, and cooperation. These were just the first steps towards the greatest ascent in human history. The paintings on the dark walls of the caves tell a story. During the Ice Age, people didn't just learn how to survive, they also paid close attention to nature. They knew the seasons, the direction of the wind, when the rain would come, and the severity of winter. They had learned which game was plentiful in which season and which animal was more profitable to hunt. Meat was the king's food of that era. Farming had not yet been discovered, so hunting was life itself. People became better hunters over time. Using stone and wood traps, spears and arrows, they hunted animals in groups. Every hunt was a battle, a plan, and a strategy. The food left over from each hunt kept a family alive. Then, around 50,000 years ago, one of history's greatest inventions came to be: the bow and arrow. People could now safely and skillfully hunt from a distance and catch massive animals. Because of this, they were significantly more likely to survive the harsh Ice Age conditions. It was the story of humanity's resilience through every step, plan, and hunt. Even as the land began to thaw and the ice began to recede, humanity could no longer settle for merely surviving. He learns, thinks, acts together, and passes his experience on to future generations. The first conversations, the cave paintings, and every new tool created around the first fire were the first steps on humanity's path to eternity. The gigantic beasts vanished after the end of the Ice Age, but the human will, intellect, and capacity for cooperation, and a desire to endure under any circumstances remained the most powerful legacy on this planet.